The Yuan Dynasty wasn't born in the steppes. It was forged in the mud, blood, and stone of Xiangyang. In 1268, Kublai Khan faced a paradox no rider could outrun: a walled city sitting at the confluence of the Han and Yangtze rivers. Xiangyang and Fan, its twin stronghold, formed a fluvial bottleneck, a gargalo logistico, barring access to the Song dynasty's southern heartland. The Mongols had conquered empires on horseback. Here, speed meant nothing. Siege was the only language this city understood. But Mongols didn't siege. Not traditionally. That was the point. Kublai's generals urged an all-out assault. Decision A, brute force, fast and costly. Instead, he gambled on decision B, investing in trabucos, counterweight catapults imported from Persia, and adapting Chinese riverine siege tactics. It was a betrayal of their own nomadic ethos. And it worked. A Persian engineer, Ismail, arrived in 1273. Months later, the first stone crashed through Xiangyang's inner wall. The shock wasn't just physical. It cracked the image of Mongol invincibility as purely cavalry-driven. The city fell weeks later. The twin fortress Fan had already collapsed. The south was exposed. The Song no longer had a northern shield. Pause here. This wasn't just about stone on brick. It was about a shift in civilizational posture. The Mongol Empire had moved from raiders to rulers, from mobility to stability. A short account survives of a Song naval officer named Yuan Dynasty. In a desperate bid to break the blockade, he ordered a night flotilla upriver. But the Mongol ships, fitted with Chinese-style paddle wheels and fire throwers, intercepted them midstream. Lu's fleet never reached the walls. His defeat sealed the city's fate, and arguably, the dynasty's. What's at stake wasn't merely conquest. Kublai's decision, engineering over tradition, set the tone for the Yuan dynasty's imperial structure. It showed that power wasn't just taking, it was holding, and that meant adapting, not just overwhelming. When the empire starts looking like the land it conquers, who does it still belong to? The walls of Xiangyang had crumbled, but Kublai's true challenge was yet to come, proving that victory by adaptation wouldn't fracture the empire from within. By 1274, murmurs echoed through the Mongol command camps. Traditionalists whispered that the Yuan court had grown too comfortable with silk robes and Chinese rituals. The cavalry elite, men who had ridden from Samarkand to the Yellow River, now served under Chinese advisors and siege engineers. The choice had been made in Xiangyang. Decision B, investing in siegecraft and naval warfare, had paid off. But it came at a cost, one measured not in casualties, but in cultural authority. Let's pause here. What Kublai gained in territory, he risked losing in loyalty. The Mongol aristocracy, forged in the egalitarian codes of the steppe, now found itself subordinate in a court where Confucian hierarchies dictated command line. To placate both fronts, military and moral, Kublai restructured command. Mongol generals retained field control, but technical roles like logistics and artillery command were assigned to Persians and Han Chinese. It was a coalition of necessity, not harmony. A notable example, the naval engineer Guoshojing, a Chinese polymath, was placed in charge of river fortifications along the Yangtze. His plans, involving mobile platforms with artillery naval, helped secure Yuan control over critical crossings. Yet his very appointment was a signal that expertise now trumped lineage. A short chronicle from the Yuan Shi notes how some Mongol officers refused to take orders from non-Mongols, delaying the deployment of critical artillery at Azhou. That hesitation nearly cost them the post. The artillery arrived late, but the Song had already withdrawn, fearing encirclement. Kublai's internal gamble had worked, just barely. The consequence? A redefinition of command culture. The Yuan army was no longer purely Mongol in form or philosophy. It was hybrid, hierarchical, and increasingly bureaucratic. In the end, the Mongols had to choose between purity and permanence. They couldn't have both. Next, when the Song fleet makes its last stand on the Yangtze, and the water itself becomes a weapon. The road to Hangzhou wasn't paved, it floated. Literally. To take the Song capital, Kublai's forces had to cross a web of rivers and canals. The Yangtze wasn't a barrier anymore. It had become a weapon. Control the water, and you controlled the war. After the fall of Xiangyang, Mongol logistics shifted. The decision: force a direct crossing with massed barges, risking overextension, or build mobile pontes fluctuants in advance in staggered waves. General Bayan chose B, slower but stable. The first wave of the vanguard naval launched in late 1275. Using Song-style paddle boats and pontoon bridges lashed from commandeered fishing vessels, they moved with the current and struck hard. The Song defenders attempted to sabotage the crossings at night, burning rafts and ambushing riverbanks. But by then, Bayan had already secured fallback nodes upriver. Contingency planning learned from years of Persian and Chinese advisors. Let's break this down. Every kilometer gained on water saved 10 on foot. In southern China's wet terrain, speed wasn't just efficiency, it was survival. The rivers were roads, and the Song had lost the map. Hangzhou itself was beautiful and doomed. Its last defenders had no fleet, no allies, and no time. By early 1276, Yuan troops surrounded the city. The young emperor was carried out under a white banner. It wasn't a dramatic last stand, it was a surrender. A local record describes how the city's population wept not from fear, but from fatigue. Generals had changed, regimes had shifted, but the rivers kept flowing. The war had soaked into daily life. What this tells us is clear: adaptation wasn't optional. The Mongols had to become amphibious to win. And once they did, the Song's geographical advantage turned into a trap. But now the question deepens. If the Mongols conquered the land, what happens when the land begins to conquer them? Conquering land is fast. Governing it is slow. And in China, even slower. After the fall of Hangzhou, Kublai faced a new dilemma: maintain the Mongol elite's grip on power, or create a durable administratio mixta with Chinese civil servants. He chose the second option, a decision that stabilized the empire but diluted its core. In 1279, the Yuan Dynasty formalized a hierarchia ethnica. Mongols at the top, followed by Central Asians, Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Han. It wasn't equality, it was a system of control. Each group had distinct rights, duties, and restrictions. Loyalty was engineered through hierarchy. Pause here. This was not a moral choice. It was logistical. Governing over 60 million people with 300,000 Mongols required institutions, not instincts. And for that, Kublai needed the bureaucrats who once served the Song. A key architect of this model was Liu Bingzhou, a Chinese advisor who designed administrative districts, land tax schemes, and even helped plan the new capital, Kambalik. Yet every concession to Chinese norms strained the Mongol identity. Traditionalists called the capital too silent, the robes too wide, the rituals too slow. Meanwhile, the peripheries simmered. In Yunnan and Fujian, local leaders resisted tax collectors appointed from the capital. In some areas, Mongol garrisons were recalled not to fight enemies, but to suppress governors gone rogue. A small but telling case. In Jiangxi, a rebellion broke out after new grain levies were introduced without local consultation. It took 6 months to restore control, not through battle, but through negotiated exemptions. The Yuan state was effective but fragile, a balancing act of force and formality. And in choosing bureaucracy over bloodlines, Kublai shifted the legacy of Genghis from conquest to consolidation. The implication? Once the conquerors learned to govern like the conquered, whose empire is it, really? What begins as victory can end as absorption. By the early 1290s, 2 decades after the fall of the Song, the Yuan court no longer resembled a nomadic camp. Its palaces mimicked Tang architecture. Its rituals followed Confucian scripts. Its officials, more often than not, spoke Chinese, wrote in Chinese, and governed with Chinese norms. The empire hadn't just conquered China, it had become part of it. Kublai had made the civilizational choice. Decision B, embrace Sinizakeo, the deep adoption of Chinese ways, over decision resisting and preserving a separate Mongol identity. His court was orderly, his administration was efficient, but the price was dilution. Pause here. The very success of empire brought its cultural erosion. Once the Mongols began building rather than burning, marrying locals rather than raiding them, their memory of the steppe began to fade. By 1300, the court's lineage successoria was already fragile. Kublai's grandson, Timur, ruled more like a Confucian emperor than a steppe Khan. He held court seated on a platform, not on a saddle. His edicts cited heaven's mandate, not Genghis's will. The clearest symbol? Names. The original Mongol titles gave way to Chinese imperial phrasing. A Khagan was now a Huangdi. It sounded imperial, but not Mongol. In the heartland of Mongolia, discontent brewed. Tribes complained of being taxed to sustain cities they had never seen. Stories of betrayal replaced songs of conquest. One telling moment. In 1320, a group of Mongol elders from the Orkhon Valley sent an envoy to Khanbaliq, pleading for the restoration of their traditional rights to roam and herd freely. The court, entangled in bureaucratic reform, never responded. That silence echoed louder than any decree. The consequence was irreversible. The Yuan had traded mobility for stability, and in doing so, they became what they once overran. An empire, yes, but no longer an empire of writers. In the end, the Yuan Dynasty didn't collapse from an invasion. It collapsed from an echo. By the mid-14th century, natural disasters, economic stagnation, and peasant uprisings tore through the once vast empire. But the roots of collapse weren't just external. They lay in what the Yuan had become. Decision A was always there. Return to steppe principles. Purge the bureaucracy. Restore nomadic rule. But no serious leader chose it. Decision B. Maintain the hybrid structure. Even as it eroded authority, remained the path. That choice preserved the system for decades, until the system stopped responding. Pause here. When your institutions mirror those of your predecessors, your collapse often does too. In 1351, the Red Turban Rebellion began in the south. The Yuan court, paralyzed by succession disputes, responded slowly. Rebel leaders like Zhu Yuanzhang drew legitimacy not from conquest, but from restoring Chinese order. The empire had taught its enemies how to govern. A glimmer of the reversal. When Zhu captured Didu, Khanbaliq, he spared the city. He didn't raise the Mongol palaces, he moved into them. In 1368, he declared the Ming Dynasty. The last Yuan emperor fled north, but the empire was already memory. This is where Memoria Imperial takes over. For centuries, Chinese historians debated, were the Yuan truly Chinese emperors, or foreign overlords in borrowed robes? The question remains open, but there's a broader pattern. Historians call it reverseo dynastica, when conquerors inherit more than land. They inherit habits. They build what they once destroyed. And in doing so, they write themselves out of their own origin story. So the final question isn't how the Mongols conquered China. It's whether, in the end, China conquered the Mongols.